you can't answer. You can just nod your heads, but it's impressive. So this is a much smaller group because this program is really for our high-level donors to CSP this year and the people who are members of our legacy circle. So feel free to turn on your cameras so you can see who's in the room and say hi. Jay Witzling, is that Princeton University gate behind you? It is? Oh my gosh. Okay, I recognize it from the old days. Okay, so we'll get started in just a bit, but as I mentioned, this is really a thank you to you, to all of you, for ensuring that we have underwriting to bring great programs to our growing national, international crowd, and in the future can continue to grow CSP. When we're not here anymore, I'm hoping someone will take my job and take over your jobs, funding, supporting, and participating. I would like to welcome some of our newest legacy members. I see Lee Evans. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, Lee. If not, chat to me and I will correct my pronunciation. But I think Lee is our first from, I think, Boise, Idaho. Is that correct? So we now have a legacy member from Boise, Idaho. I want to make sure you guys know that. So welcome, Lee. I'm looking in the room to see who else we have here. Who may be new. Alan Friedman is a new member of our legacy circle. So welcome, Alan. And Anita Rosenfield, who many of you may recognize because she comes to many programs, is a new member of our legacy circle and is from Sedona, Arizona. That's pretty cool. So yeah, I guess CSP has come a long way now in 21 years. Anyway, I'm going to start by welcoming everybody and saying it is still Thursday, the 13th of January. It's 5 p.m. out here in California, 8 p.m. where Jeff Kaufman finds himself on the East Coast in the cold weather of Boston, suburbs of Boston. And if you're keeping track, this is the 8th of our 18 total programs we're doing with faculty of Hadar. I've had many people that wanted to come to this program. I had to turn them away. And it even says like it's only for benefactors and for Legacy Circle, and they sign up anyway. So then I have to write them a note saying, I'm so sorry. 16 of them are open, no problem. 2 of them are a thank you to our people. So it is number 8, as I mentioned, out of 18. I wanted to thank the Jewish Community Foundation of Orange County for helping and basically underwriting this 1-month series so we could use our money for other programs, the money that you have given us. And we're very happy to have Rabbi Tali Adler. So where are you from, Tali? Were you coming to us live from New York?
Yeah, if you know Washington Heights, it's as far up in Manhattan as you can get without being in the Bronx.
Yes, I've heard of it. It's actually in a song by Lin-Manuel Miranda, I think from his musical, right? And also we've done a trilogy of CSP adventures in New York. And one of them, we actually spent time in Washington Heights. It was pretty cool. I'd never been up there. I have really traversed much of New York thanks to CSP, and some of you have been with me for all or some of the programs. Our topic for tonight is unfortunately very relevant to what's been going on in the United States and the world in the last 21 months. God in the midst of grief, connecting to the divine in times of loss. And we're honoring, as you know, Ed and Deborah Heyman this whole month. But this turned out to be a very interesting day. And Ed, I wanted to invite Ed to say just a few words that why this day resonates and this program resonates. So I'm going to unmute Ed and then we'll get to our program.
Hi, everybody. Today, when I first saw the calendar of events, I was struck and then sort of amused. But today is a poignant day in my family's calendar. As many of you know, and some of you probably don't, Deborah and I are second timers together. My late wife, Barbara, passed away 25 years ago. Today would have been her 70th birthday. And in the early 1970s, she attended an experimental college, Johnston College, on the grounds of the University of Redlands, which was one of the early experiments in enroll your own education. It was multidisciplinary, but she had to build her own major and her own path through the university. There were no required subjects. So she built a Jewish studies curriculum, Jewish philosophy curriculum. And the more she got into it, the more she realized that if she was going to be true to her course of study, she wanted to become a rabbi. But of course, this is 1972, and there were no women rabbis yet, not even the Reform movement had started. And the more she got into her studies, she figured, well, if she was going to dedicate herself to that level in Jewish studies, she ought to become an Orthodox rabbi, which was even more inconceivable in those days. And so she said, well, screw that, and decided to just write her senior thesis on Martin Buber and be left with it. But the fact that seeing in the course guide that Tali is Orthodox woman rabbi, and talking about grief, today would have been Barbara's 70th birthday. And I just thought that the confluence of coincidences between her desires and your accomplishments were the perfect capstone and gift for my late wife on her 70th birthday. And so, Tali, I'm dedicating this presentation to her. And I hope that you find some inspiration in knowing that you're following a path that she would have loved to have taken, but never had the opportunity to. So, kol hakavod in beginning on your accomplishments, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for sharing that and that story. I'm just going to say a few words about Tali, to Rabbi Adler. How do you want to be referred to?
Tali is fine.
Okay. And then we'll get to our subject. First of all, I am putting in the chat right now. I'll put in the handout for today, so you have it. And let me just make sure that works. Okay. There you go. So Rabbi Tali Adler, a musmekhet of Yeshivat Maharat. A lot to unpack there for those who don't follow the words, and maybe Tali, you can explain to people what that means. Received her undergraduate degree from Stern College, where she majored in political science and Jewish studies. A Wexner Graduate Fellow during her time at Yeshivat Maharat. Tali served as the clergy intern at Kehilat, Rayim, Ahuvim, and Harvard Hillel. Tali has studied in a number of Jewish institutions, including Drisha and Midreshet Harova. We're very happy to have you for our program tonight on a very important topic. I'm going to mute myself and looking forward to learning with you and with our group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. The punchline of that bio is basically that I was ordained by Yeshivat Maharat, the first Orthodox institution to ordain women, and that I am currently lucky enough to be on faculty at Yeshivat Hadar. I wanted to, before we get started, just say one word. Ed, I was so grateful for what you shared about your late wife. And even though she didn't get to do it, part of the reason I got to do this is because all of the women who dreamed that dream a little bit before it started to happen. And I'm grateful to her for being one of those women. All right. A bit about what we're going to be doing tonight. Our core text for tonight is going to be a text by the Wexner Rebbe. He is most well known for the text that he wrote, actually that he first delivered orally as a series of sermons in the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm going to say a little word about him before we begin, because it's really who he is and the project that he undertakes that shapes the text we're going to be looking at together tonight. What you have to, what you have to know about the Wexner Rebbe is that in the Warsaw Ghetto, he was one of the greatest rabbinic figures and had a following of Hasidim. He had published several books before the war, and the work that we're going to be looking at tonight, known as the Eish Kodesh, or the Holy Flame, is a work which he compiled that consisted of the sermons that he would get up and give in synagogue every Shabbat. And they reflect over the course of the years, his struggles with how do I understand what it means to be a religious human being, a human being in relationship with God in the face of just unbelievable suffering. And part of what you see him start to do as the years go on is take traditional Jewish ideas of how do we make sense of suffering, how do we make sense of grief, look at them and feel that they no longer stand up in the face of just the magnitude of what he's seeing. And he begins to redefine them. He begins to take those concepts and make them into something new. And the concept that we'll be looking at together today is a concept called Hesterpanim, or the concealment of the face. I'm sure some people in this room have encountered that concept before. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, that concept is the idea that there are certain points in the world where God actually turns God's face away from the world and God becomes inaccessible to humanity. It's one traditional Jewish way of making sense of when things seem to just be going so incredibly wrong. How do you possibly make sense of that? I noticed that Vivian Berger put in the chat that it's the second yard site for her beloved son tomorrow. And first of all, I want to thank Vivian for that. And second of all, I want to say, part of what I hope we can do tonight is we are all people who are standing here to greater and less degrees with our own grief that we bring into the room. And part of the work that I want us to do tonight is to look at this text together and ask ourselves honestly, is this something that for those of us who stand in the wake of incredible grief, who have gone through grief in our lives, is the idea that the Rebbe is presenting something that feels accessible, something that feels possible, something that feels like it could have actual religious and emotional implications for our lives. That's the background. Let's dive in. I'll be screen sharing and I'm going to stop every so often for questions. I'm going to ask that if you have a question or a comment while I'm in the middle of speaking, please put it in the chat. I'll be pausing every so often to scan the chat to make sure that I've seen what's coming up. Let's get started. Okay, the first text we're going to be looking at fairly briefly is a text from the Talmud, from the Tractate Chagiga. And the reason we're looking at this text and the next text is because they'll make up the core of what the Pietzazner Rebbe is going to be playing with. In classic Hasidic fashion, he is taking older, more classic rabbinic texts and playing with them to create something new. Let's get started. But if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret, b'mistarim, for your pride. The Gemara, the Talmud, is starting with a verse, with a pasuk from the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. And they're going to do something, which is they're going to look at the word in secret, b'mistarim, and take that not simply at face value, but say, actually, that word b'mistarim, the bet there, the in secret, is actually talking about in a place. And that is a place where God goes when God is experiencing grief. Rav Shmuel Bar Enya said in the name of Rav, the Holy One, blessed be He, has a place, and its name is Mistarim. So starting point, God has this place, this kind of secretive place that is being referenced in this verse. That means, of course, that we have to go back and reread the verse. What does it mean if the verse is not saying, I shall weep in secret, but I shall weep in mistarim? Why is the weeping, why is the crying happening specifically in this place? We're going to get the answer when we go ahead to the next paragraph. But is there crying before the Holy One, blessed be He? Meaning, here's what just happened. They're looking at that pasuk in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah and saying, Who is crying in that verse? It is actually God crying in that verse. And God is looking at the Jewish people being led into exile and saying, I am crying in my secret place called Mistarim. And the Gemara asks a fascinating question, which is there crying before God? Meaning, I thought that God doesn't cry. And the Gemara is about to explain why. Didn't Rav Papa say there is no sadness before the Holy One, blessed be He, as it is stated, honor and majesty are before Him, strength and gladness are in His place. So Rav Papa is chiming in here and saying, we have a tradition that there is no crying in heaven. God does not cry. What is God's experience like? God lives in honor and majesty and strength and gladness. How then can you tell me that God goes to this place called Mistarim and cries? The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. This statement, meaning the statement that says that God cries, is referring to the innermost chambers. Whereas this statement, meaning the statement that God doesn't cry, God is always in splendor and majesty and joy, that's referring to the outer chambers. Let's pause and make sure we're following all of that. The idea that we have so far is that there is actually some sort of division for God. When God is in the outer chambers of heaven, when God is in public, as it were, God looks a certain way. God is full of strength and majesty and smiles and glory. But there's an inner chamber where God goes when God actually needs to cry. We're going to finish this off. And doesn't God cry in the outer chambers? Isn't it written, and on that day the Lord, the God of hosts, called to weeping and to mourning and to fall mist and to girding with sackcloth? This is a verse from Isaiah that's talking about the destruction of the temple. And here it seems to be that God is very public about God's crying. The Gemara answers, the destruction of the temple is different, as even the angels of peace cried, as it is stated, behold, their valiant ones cry without, the angels of peace weep bitterly. That's text one. We're about to go into a second rabbinic text, which is a piece of Midrash, which again plays with this idea of God crying. And the question that I have for us that I'd like for us to discuss a little bit before we jump into the Yesh Kodesh, the Pietzazna Rebbe's writing, which is the core text we'll be looking at tonight, is the following. What's at stake in the question of whether God cries? And there are some people here, I want to repeat that one more time. What is at stake in the question of whether God cries? And I know that for some people, that question is immediately going to be grating, I think, meaning there are many people for whom the idea of God expressing any emotion or having any emotion is inaccessible or far too anthropomorphizing to be believable. I totally honor that and respect that. I want us to try for a moment, though, to imagine what would it be like to actually try on the idea of God crying? What does that spark in you? What feelings does that bring up in you? Is it an idea that you're attracted to? Is it an idea that you're repulsed by? I'm going to ask people to put those reactions in the chat, and we'll go to those right after we read the next text, this piece from Echa Rabbah, which is a midrash on the book of Echa, the book that deals with the destruction of the temple and the morning form. This text is describing God's reaction when God sees the temple destroyed. At that time, the Holy Blessed One cried and said, "Woe is me, what have I done? I brought my spirit down for Israel's sake, and now that they have sinned, I've returned to my original place. Heaven forbid I should be a laughingstock to the nations and a joke among my creatures." So God is looking at the destruction of the temple and saying, I used to have a home. I used to have a home on earth and I destroyed it. And now I, God, am homeless and I'm a mockery to all of humanity. And God is crying in this moment. At that moment, Metatron came. Metatron is the archangel. At that moment, Metatron came and fell on his face and said before God, Master of the universe, I will cry and you will not cry. Meaning the angels are rushing before God and saying, please don't cry, let me cry instead. I don't know if other people in this room or in this session, I should say, have this experience, but for me, the angel's reaction of please don't cry, I can't bear to see you cry, reminded me personally of the first time I saw one of my parents cry. Just that feeling of you are the stability in my life. If you are crying, that becomes unbearable, and the feeling for a child of the fear that comes with that. So just to remind us, Metatron is begging God, please don't cry, let me cry instead. God said, if you will not leave me to cry right now, I will go to a place that you do not have the ability to enter, and I will cry there. As it says, for if you will not give heed, my inmost self must weep in Mistarim. Again, this is a reference to that same in secret place, the place where God goes to hide God's self because of your arrogance. So God says at the end, if you're not going to let me cry, if you're going to try to stop me from crying, I will actually go somewhere else where I can cry in secret because I need to be able to cry. I'm going to pause and take a look at the chat. Again, the question that I put out was how do people respond to the idea that the possibility that God cries? Anita Rosenfield, asked a very interesting question, which is, does crying suggest weakness or perhaps strength and sensitivity? I think that your personal answer to that will shape a lot of your reaction to the idea of God crying. Meaning, if your personal conception of crying, especially crying in public, is that that's a sign of weakness, the idea of God crying is probably terrifying. It's probably earth-shaking. The idea that it's strength and sensitivity, I think, opens other options, excuse me, just a cough, not COVID, that we'll explore in the Rebbe's text. Mary Kraft and Jeff Kaufman said, God is full of compassion, of course he cries. Susan Hoods gives permission for us to cry too. Beautiful. Barbara Braverman, does that mean that God would laugh too? This is for another time, not tonight, but some of my favorite pieces from the Talmud are about God laughing and about God playing. So there's plenty of that, just not much that we'll be touching on tonight. B. Mia Reed, and if I say anyone's name wrong, I really apologize, says, it worries me, who's driving? And it angers me because I'm judged harshly for having emotions that God also has. Why? Okay, amazing. I want to step into this because I think it's so real. The Rebbe is going to go in a different direction in the core text that we're going to see. But I really want to lift up that voice. We live in a world that so often punishes us for feeling grief, that so often punishes us for feeling sadness. And one response that we might have is, if we have to keep it together, then of course God has to keep it together. And also, God, we need you to keep it together. At the end of the day, if you are not keeping it together, if you're crying, if you're falling apart, what is there for the rest of us? And that's the voice of the angels here. That's the voice of, we need you to have some semblance of control. Alita Bryant says, when you love and care about someone, you do not ever want to make them cry. It makes me want to do everything I can to make God happy. That's beautiful. Anita Rosenfield, when I saw my dad cry at a performance of Showboat, I felt closer to him, felt his sensitivity. Thank you for sharing that. Lee Evans, everyone who loves cries. God has been referred to as the most tragic character in the Bible. Crying then transcends the human condition. I don't see how it can be anything other than a true part of the universe. That's beautiful. Tali and Katz, I believe that God cries and was also in exile with us. Dahlia Taft, I love this idea. It means God is pained by suffering in the universe. What a wonderful comment. What a wonderful concept. And I'm going to read two more, even though there's still comments coming in. I'll also say that if you chatted me privately, I am reading your comment. I'm just not going to read it out loud because I assume that you chatted it to me privately for a reason. Mary Kraft and Jeff Kaufman from Jeff, if God cries, does this imply or buttress that God has female attributes? I think that that question hinges on two things. Well, the first question is how much do you think the idea of crying is tied to femininity, which is a very culture-based question, is in some places even a very down to a family-based question. But I love that that opens up the idea of, well, maybe we can talk about God as more feminine here, or maybe we can talk about crying as more masculine, and both of those actually being possibilities. Howard Merowitz, this is the last comment for now. We know God can feel loneliness because otherwise why would God have created a universe, an other, so that God could know love, the one thing that paradoxically God as an absolutely infinite unity cannot access, which therefore prevented God from actually being infinite. This is amazing. Howard is not a plant, but Howard actually just gave the perfect segue into the next text we're going to be looking at. Because part of what the Rebbe is struck by, and part of what the Rebbe is going to play with here, is the idea of, in this text, God has to go into a room alone in order to be allowed to cry. And for the Rebbe, that is the most devastatingly lonely thing imaginable, the idea of God having to cry and God having to cry alone. And what the Rebbe is going to do here is offer an idea of, actually, when we are in the midst of grief, God is also grieving. And when we are in the midst of grief, that grief can actually connect us more closely to God and allow us, as it were, to offer God a shoulder to cry on. Let's see how he does that. Again, I am going to ask people if there are questions that come up as we're going through the text, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. All right, let's take a look. Okay, this is the Eish Kodesh. It was delivered March 14th, 1942. It could be asked how Moses could have had a prophetic revelation when to receive prophecy, a person must be in a state of joy. There's an idea that pops up in the Gemara that in order to receive prophecy, someone has to be in a state of joy. And there are all sorts of links to maybe that's why prophets seem to sometimes listen to music in order to get them into the proper state of joy to be able to access God. And Pietz-Ezler Rebbe is saying, if that's so, how could Moses have possibly received prophecy? And he'll spell out what's behind that question. Aside from the fact that Pharaoh was trying to kill him, Moshe was anguished over the pain of the Jewish people. Moshe had such empathy with the pain of the Jews that he later said to God, this is after the sin of the golden calf, please forgive their sin. If not, blot me out from this book that you have written. This is the very reason why God appeared to Moshe for the first time from within the burning thorn bush. Rashi explains that the choice of the thorn bush by quoting the verse, I am with him in his pain, imo anochi b'tzara. So let's just make sure we understood all of that. The Rebbe is starting with the question, how can it be that it can be true that you have to be in a state of joy to receive prophecy, and that Moshe received prophecy when we know that Moshe was so anguished over the suffering of the Jewish people? And he is going to answer that question by saying, actually, that is only sometimes true. so long as God has only strength and rejoicing in his abode, meaning when God is experiencing joy, then prophets too can prophesy only when they are b'simcha, joyous. But when God is, as it were, together with the Jews in their pain and trouble, then prophecy may also come to the prophet, who is likewise in pain over the plight of the Jews. You know why joy is sometimes important for a prophet? Because when God is joyous, to be able to tap into God, you have to be experiencing joy. You have to be on the same wavelength, as it were. But when God is suffering, because the Jewish people, and for the Rebbe, it is about the Jewish people, are suffering, then actually there's a different characteristic that allows you to tap into prophecy. Then the characteristic that allows you to tap into prophecy is actually also being in a state of grief. Your grief in those times actually becomes not a barrier to God, but a way of accessing God. In the Talmud, Chagiga 5b, that was the piece that we looked at together, we learn, it is written, my soul weeps in Mistarim. Is there any weeping on the face of the Holy Blessed One? Behold, Rav Papa said, there is no grief on the face of the Holy One, as it is written, beauty and splendor before him, strength and rejoicing in his abode. There is no contradiction. One verse refers to the inner chambers, while the other refers to the outer chambers. This so far was just a quote from the piece of Talmud that we looked at together. Thus we learn that while in the outer chambers of heaven, there is always strength and rejoicing before God. Within the inner chambers, God weeps in his distress, as it were, over the pain of the Jews. I want us to notice a few things that the Rebbe has done so far. First of all, the Rebbe is getting up to a group of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he is telling them, God feels grief over our grief. God is actually suffering because of our suffering. And part of what the Rebbe is doing there is addressing the feeling that I think we so often have when we are in grief, which is, how can this be happening if God cares? And what he's doing right now is not offering any sort of theodicy. He's not offering a way to reconcile the terrible things that are happening to them with God's abilities. But what he is promising them is God cares, and when you are crying, God is crying. The second thing that he's doing is looking at them and saying, I know that sometimes it feels like your grief can actually bar you from God. Like it is harder to access God when you are crying. But something that you need to know is that sometimes that grief can actually bring you closer together with God if you believe that God is crying as well. And we'll see how he develops that in the coming paragraphs. I'm going to stop just for a moment to check the chat. Talia and Katz had a very interesting comment about how God separating God's self to cry kind of mirrors when Joseph separated himself from his brothers when he cried. That's beautiful. Jeff Kaufman, was Jonah in a state of joy when God spoke to him? I certainly can't imagine so, personally. I don't understand why joy is a requirement. Was Abraham in a state of joy when he was told to sacrifice Isaac? Yes, there are many, many contradictions from Tanakh, from the Bible, that you can raise to the idea that prophets need to be in a state of joy. Just for the sake of time tonight, and because for the Rebbe, that's only a jumping off point, we're not going to delve too deeply into that idea and those defenses. But I do want to kind of raise up that voice that actually there are so many stories of people in the Bible, in Tanakh, accessing God in times of grief. The Evans, most of the prophets speaking truth to power, showed scant evidence of simcha. Again, I absolutely agree with that. Let's keep going. And here the Rebbe is going to introduce the idea of Hesterpanim, and he's going to play with it, To remind us, usually the idea of Hesterpanim is the idea that why are there bad things happening in the world? It's because God has at this time chosen to conceal God's self from the world. God has hidden God's face. The Rebbe is going to do something different, which is to say, the Rebbe is going to say, why does God hide God's face in times of grief, in times of suffering in the world? It is not that hiding of God's face causes the suffering in the world. Is that God goes and hides in reaction to the suffering in the world, because God needs to go somewhere to hide where God can cry about the suffering. Let's see how he does that. So it is possible that at a time of Hesterpanim, concealment of the divine face, which is to say, when God hides himself within the inner chambers, a Jew may also enter and be alone with God there, each Jew at his own level. There within the inner chambers, Torah and worship is revealed to each person who enters. We've already spoken about how the oral Torah was revealed primarily in exile in Babylon, and how the Holy Zohar was only revealed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar when they were in a cave fleeing the Roman government, afraid for their lives. Let's take that apart. The Rebbe is doing something new with this idea of God's hidden chamber where God goes to cry. And the Rebbe is saying, God goes there because the angels are afraid of God's grief. But you know what you can do? You can do something that angels cannot. You can do something if you are, I would say, brave enough that angels are afraid to do. And that is you can follow God there. In those times of grief where suffering in the world is overwhelming, where you are feeling that suffering, you can actually follow God there, and you can actually be together there with God. Let's take a moment. We'll see how he develops that further. I'll just say one word about the Rebbe's idea here about the oral Torah being revealed primarily in exile. The Rebbe has an idea that he develops elsewhere, that there are parts of Jewish texts that are only revealed in exile because there are parts of Torah that human beings that can only really develop and come to understand when they have experienced suffering. It's a, I think, challenging idea of what Torah is and what grief can do, but it's one that he really believes in. Let's keep going. And I'm going to ask us as we go on. Again, always please feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. But the question I want us to reflect on is, we have all in some way experienced grief before. Is this picture of a religious experience that the Pietzazner Rebbe is drawing here? Is it something that you can actually imagine? Is it something that you can believe in? Is it something that you feel could help you in times of grief? Let's go back to the text. There are times when a person wonders about himself, thinking, I am broken, I am ready to burst into tears at any moment. And in fact, I break down in tears from time to time. How can I possibly learn Torah? What can I do to find the strength not just to learn Torah, but to discover new Torah and Chassidut? The Rebbe here is expressing this in primarily religious language, but I think part of what he's describing is the paralysis that grief can cause, the feeling that I'm stuck. I can't actually get up and do anything. I can't actually in this moment get up and absorb, get up and create. That feels completely inaccessible to me. It feels like grief is blocking me. Then there are times when a person beats his heart saying, is it not simply my supercilious heart allowing me to be so stubborn, to learn Torah in the midst of my pain, in the midst of the pain of Jews whose suffering is so great? And here he's pointing out something different, which is sometimes when we are in the midst of great suffering, anything religious or involving Torah can feel self-indulgent. I'll say that I certainly felt I don't know if any of you were in New York during March or April of, God, was it 2020? Where anytime you opened the window, all you heard was the sirens from the ambulances all the time. But I was getting up every day and I was going on Zoom and I was teaching Torah. And there were times where I felt like, what am I doing? What meaning can this possibly have in the meaning of such suffering? And that's what the Rebbe's doing here. He's saying that feeling of what are we doing when we get up and we go to synagogue on Saturday? What are we doing when we go to a Zoom class in the midst of such suffering? He's saying that's normal. And also, I believe that you are doing something important. And here's what he's going to say. So he's talking about this person's internal dialogue in the face of grief. And then he continues the internal dialogue. And then he answers himself, but I am so broken. I have cried so much. My whole life is fraught with grief and dejection. He is lost inside his introspective, self-analytical confusion. But as we have said, it is the holy blessed one who is crying within the inner chambers. And whoever presses himself close to God through Torah is able to weep there together with God and also to learn Torah with him. And here the Rebbe is describing the part of grief that I think can, for some of us, be the most devastating. And that's the isolation. The way that grief sometimes draws you in just to yourself, to the feeling that you are utterly alone. And he is saying, actually, in that moment, you don't have to be utterly alone because there is someone else who is experiencing that grief. And if you are bold enough, courageous enough to push into the inner chambers, you can actually cry together with God. This is the difference. The pain and grief he suffers over his own situation, alone in isolation, can break a person. He may even fall so far that he becomes immobilized by it. But the crying that a person does together with God makes him strong. He cries and takes strength. He is shattered and is then emboldened to study and worship. I want to read that one more time because I think for the Rebbe, it's true about God. And I think for so many of us, whether or not it's true about God, it is true about at least other human beings. I'm going to read it one more time. This is the difference. The pain and grief he suffers over his own situation, alone in isolation, can break a person. He may even fall so far that he becomes immobilized by it. But the crying that a person does together with God makes him strong. He cries and takes strength. He is shattered and then emboldened to study and worship. It is only the first or second time that a person finds it difficult to pick himself up because of the pain. If he is bold, if he stretches out his head to touch the Torah and worship, he gains access to those innermost chambers where God is. There he laments and ululates with God, as it were, alone with him. Then, even in the midst of pain, he can learn Torah and worship God's blessed devotions. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment, and I'm going to check the chat. I also want people, if they want, to get the opportunity to unmute themselves and respond. If you want to actually respond to this text by unmuting yourself, please message Ari and he will unmute you. I'm going to start with Anita. Anita says, I will need to change my perspective based on these teachings because my tendency during times of grief is to pull away from God. I'll tell you, Anita, I love this text. I've been studying it over and over and over again for the past 3 years, and I personally am still really working on that. It's an amazing vision. It's also a hard vision, but I'm happy that it appeals to you. Talia Kat says it's so amazing that he himself kept writing his Torah. However, after losing both his wife and then his son in the Warsaw Ghetto, he had a period that he could not write, and so there's a gap in his commentaries on the Torah. I want to make sure to spell out what Talian is getting at here, because it's true and it's so important to understand about the Pietzasner Rebbe so you can understand the person who's writing this. The Pietzasner Rebbe, of course, is in the Warsaw Ghetto, and of course that in and of itself is tremendous suffering. He also saw the death of his son. He saw the death of his wife. There are indeed lulls in the sermons from those weeks. We don't have them, and we can only imagine that that is because of the overwhelming grief. He also died not knowing that his daughter actually had died before him. Here's one other thing that I always try to say when I teach anything from the Pietzasner Rebbe on that topic. The Pietzasner Rebbe had many ideas about what does it mean for a human being to achieve immortality. And he says that there are different ways for human beings can do that. One of them is to have children who live after them, and those children kind of carry on the person's spirit in the world. The Rebbe died not knowing that he no longer had that. The other, he said, is through writings. He believed that if you leave writings behind, every time someone reads them, they actually, in a way, are waking up a part of your soul, and that your soul exists in the world for a little while. So hopefully that's part of what we're doing together tonight. Lee Evans says it's the mitzvah to make life better, both for yourself and for others. That's why we have minyanim. That's beautiful. And then Martin Brower added, saying the Kaddish. I want to give people, if they want right now, the opportunity to unmute themselves. I think that this can be a hard thing to put down in the chat, and that's why. How is this piece landing on you? How are you feeling about it? Is this something that actually, this idea of we can cry together with God in grief, is it something that feels accessible to you, appealing to you, believable to you? And
Rabbi,
again,
I'd like to.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'd like to. Thank you. I'd like to work on this idea of grieving with God in partnership, which it seems that the text is alluding to, in which our grief as a key to the inner chamber, if God is in fact grieving along with us. Does this also suggest, as Martin was alluding, that by saying Kaddish, in essence, we're helping restore God's equanimity at the same time as we are restoring our own? And does that give us reason to, or does that give us more reason, if I will, to engage in the mourning cycles? Because we're doing it not only for ourselves, but for God as well. And in essence, then restoring all of humanity, because if we're helping make God better, then everyone is going to benefit. You know, in tradition, you know, we sort of feel like community is embracing us for us to get over it, but are we also helping restore the world in that sense, if in fact we're communing with God during this process?
Sorry, I'm still reacting to that. That idea is so beautiful. I never thought of that before at all. And I just want to share, when you said that, I understood the words that we actually say in the Kaddish, Yid Gadal V'Yid Kadesh Merabah, may God's name be manifested and glorified and made holy in the world, as actually something very different, of actually you're reaching in and taking God by the hand and saying, come, we're going to be here, we're going to do this, I'm going to help you be back in the world. And that's gorgeous. Thank you. Tali Ann, go ahead.
Okay. First, I want to thank you so much, because I have loved, when I first discovered the Pietzasner Rebbe, and I just was so blown away every time I read his parshiot, because it's it's like he can, how courageous that he never talked about the ugliness and all the forces, but it was always bringing out, giving over the pureness of the Torah. And so when the also, and that you can feel throughout his relationship with God. And I just think the fact that that we walk hand in hand, you know, we're from the beginning of Bereshit, we're co-creators. And so that if not just then, but every moment in our lives, if one can think that way, and especially the last person we're talking about the Kaddish, is that it's it's reaffirmation of our connection. Not only the person that but if for a year that you're doing saying Kaddish, it's also that intimacy that's happening with you and Hashem at that time, and that then to take that experience, to take it through the day through prayer, or see it in every moment.
I love that reminder of take it through the daily prayer, see it in every moment. It's beautiful, and it's also so challenging. So beautiful and so challenging. If anyone wants to chime in, please don't hesitate. You can use the raise hand function. I want to also read 2 comments that came in on the chat. Rochelle Ambersam said, is the goal to get over our grief or to go forward through our grief? I can't pretend to answer that question. I think that question is different for everyone. I think that the vision that the Pietzesner Rebbe is offering specifically is of going forward through the grief. And I think that he's offering a vision of there are certain things that you can actually only find by going through the grief that you never would have found otherwise. And for him, that is holiness, and that also is Torah. I'm going to read Dahlia Taft's comment. This reminds me of the popular poem Footprints in the Sand. The poem describes the person walking on a beach with God, leaving 2 sets of footprints in the sand. The 2 trails dwindle to one at the lowest and most hopeless moment in the person's life. When questioning God, believing that God must have abandoned him during those times, God explains, during those times of trial and suffering, when you see only 1 set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. I love that. And I think that the Pietzesner Rebbe is taking that a step further even. The Pietzesner Rebbe is saying, yes, there are times in your life where God has carried you without you knowing. And there are times where there is 1 set of footprints because you have stepped in and you have carried God. You have pushed into that chamber where God is crying alone, and you have been there for God in a place where even the angels are afraid to go. And in that moment, God actually needed you as much, or maybe even more than you needed God. Is it Alita or Aletta?
Alita, hi.
Alita.
The references to the inner chambers and the outer chambers, when I first heard it, I was thinking of like a temple. You have the inner chamber, you have the outer chamber. And that's easier to envision when you're speaking about God, having this physical outer and inner chamber. But when we're talking about inner and outer chambers in this context, are they physical? Are they metaphorical? And if they are for God, what are they for us? What are our outer and inner chambers?
Yeah, I love that question. I want to also throw it out to the group. I'll say 2 things about that. One is, for me personally, and I can't speak for everyone here, for me personally, when we're speaking about God in terms like this, we're always speaking in poetry rather than prose. To the point, I think that that words like physical or metaphor aren't even adequate, perhaps. I'll also say that what you just said about what are our inner and outer chambers was really helpful for me, because something that there comes a point in grief where people expect when you go out in public, you to be composed. Those are the outer chambers, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you're actually ready for it. That's one way of thinking about inner and outer chambers. Another way of thinking about inner inner and outer chambers is sometimes something that human beings will do when we're in the middle of grief is kind of try to make it not there by compressing it into a part of ourselves that we try not to go to. And that makes me wonder about, well, what would it look like for us to say sometimes that I go there and sometimes there are only very few people who follow me there. And sometimes maybe it's only God who can follow me there. I'm curious, again, I want other people to feel free to respond to Alita's beautiful, beautiful prompts. I think Tali Ann is raising her hand again. Go ahead. Oh, I think you need to unmute.
So for me, learning it, in Kabbalah, when I think of the inner and outer chamber, with thinking coming from that soul place, and from the your inner self, and then your outer self is how you show yourself in the world. So I think you were also alluding to it, is that we're crying inside. Many times that many people are really crying inside and they're not speaking it, but it's crying within from the place of their soul level, and they're not able to maybe openly do it from the outside.
I have learned very, very little Kabbalah, so I'm so grateful to you for sharing that. All right. Anyone else want to say anything before we go on to one last text? Okay. I mentioned before that when we're talking about God in these terms, for me personally, we get to the realm of poetry rather than of prose. We are going to finish off by reading one final text from actually Rilke, which to me offers a different window into what the Rebbe is talking about. Rilke is a German poet. He writes, I believe, in the beginning of the 20th century, largely religious poetry. There's a fabulous translation out that we'll be reading the poem from, done by Anita Barrows and Joanna Macy. That is just breathtakingly beautiful. If any of you are Rilke fans or poetry buffs, I highly recommend it. Let's take a look. This is from Rilke's Book of Hours, Love Poems to God. You, God, who live next door, if at times through the long night I trouble you with my urgent knocking, this is why. I hear you breathe so seldom. I know you're all alone in that room. If you should be thirsty, there's no one to get you a glass of water. I wait listening always. Just give me a sign. I'm right here. As it happens, the wall between us is very thin. Why couldn't a cry from one of us break it down? It would crumble easily. It would barely make a sound. We're gonna close up here. This is my wish for us, and it's taken partially from Rilke and mostly, I think, from the Rebbe. In a time where so many of us are experiencing so much grief, and that grief can make us feel so lonely, may we really believe that the walls between us are thin. The walls between us and God, the walls between us and each other are thin. And may we really believe that a cry can actually bring them down. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I hope I get the opportunity to learn with you again. I am going to turn it over to you in case you have anything that you want to say before we wrap up.
I just wanted to thank you for the special teaching tonight. It gives us a lot to think about. And the Eish Kodesh seems to be in vogue these days. It's like the third person I know in the last year or two that's been focusing on him. I don't know whether it's because of a rediscovery or because of what we're all going through and more resonance of his teachings. But thank you for bringing his teaching to us tonight. Thinking of all of you, I know many of you have lost people recently, parents, children, spouses. So I hope this was meaningful for you. And I want to thank you all for being meaningful to me and to CSP. I wish you all a great and restful Shabbos, and please take care. You're important to me. I want to keep you all healthy and learning. Okay, so I think the age coach will be very happy that you're continuing to learn through all of this, and you're with CSP. Thank you to Ed Heyman for sharing his story with us, and I'm going home to have dinner with my children. So take care, everybody. And Shabbat Shalom in advance, and it's Shabbat Shira. So enjoy Shol this Shabbos. Thank you, Rabbi Adler. Thank you, Tali. Bye-bye.